Medieval merchants documented 47,000 plus transactions in wax tablets, yet you've never heard of them. In 1974, a sealed German latrine revealed a notebook that upended everything historians believed about how your ancestors actually tracked money. The pages survived 700 years. The handwriting contradicted every rule. But here's what's strangest: the accounting method inside suggests medieval record-keeping was far more sophisticated than match any known system. The tablet was deliberately discarded when they never were, and the final entry ends mid-sentence, as if whoever was writing stopped suddenly and threw it away. No one has figured out why. It's 1974. A construction crew in Erfurt, East Germany, breaks ground on a routine urban excavation. Beneath the foundations of what was once a medieval merchant district, they hit a cesspit, a latrine pit sealed for roughly 700 years. Inside the silt and decay, excavators pull out something that shouldn't be intact. A notebook. A wax tablet notebook, its wooden frame still hinged, its wax surfaces still bearing the impressions of a stylus. Still readable. That alone would have been remarkable. But it's what's written inside that archaeologists still cannot fully explain. Wax tablets were the notebooks of the medieval world. If you've never encountered one, picture a shallow wooden frame, sometimes hinged together in pairs or sets, filled with a thin layer of darkened beeswax. You wrote on the surface with a pointed stylus, read what you needed, then smoothed the wax flat and wrote again. They were reusable. Practical. And because of that utility, they were almost never thrown away. That's the first thing that doesn't fit. The Erfurt tablet notebook, now catalogued among a small collection of surviving medieval wax tablets in German-speaking Europe, didn't fall into the latrine by accident. The pit had been sealed. The tablets were inside a layer of compacted organic material that suggested deliberate discard, not accidental loss. Someone put them there. Who? And why not simply smooth the wax and start again? Medieval literacy is where most people's assumptions get complicated. The standard figure cited in historical surveys is that fewer than 10% of the lay population in 13th century Central Europe could read or write with any competence. Literacy was largely the domain of clergy, trained scribes, and the uppermost tier of merchant families conducting long-distance trade. In the records I've kept, the artifacts that surface from urban cesspits tend to reflect the lowest strata of daily life: broken pottery, discarded food, cheap personal objects. What they almost never contain is evidence of sophisticated written culture. The Erfurt notebook is an exception that cuts against everything the pit itself implies. The contents, as painstakingly reconstructed by researchers who studied the surviving impressions, include what appear to be accounting notations, columns of figures and abbreviated Latin terms consistent with commercial bookkeeping. There are also fragments of what some scholars have identified as excerpts from formal Latin texts. Not liturgical passages. Not simple prayers. Something closer to administrative or legal Latin, the kind of language that required formal training to produce. This is where the problem deepens. But here's what the early reports didn't emphasize, and what changes the entire picture. The notebook doesn't show one hand. It shows at least two. Possibly three. That single detail, buried in the technical analysis, reframes everything. A personal notebook discarded by one owner is one kind of mystery. A shared document, or a document that passed between hands, accumulated entries, served multiple users, is a different kind of mystery entirely. It implies a network. A practice. Not one literate person making a mistake, but a system of written exchange being deliberately concealed in a cesspit. 3 things I'll show you in the next 2 minutes overturn the most comfortable explanation. Scholars have settled on, and the last one sat unaddressed in the published record for decades. The comfortable explanation, the one that circulated in regional archaeological literature through the 1980s and into the 1990s, was this: the tablets belonged to a merchant. A prosperous one, literate enough to keep accounts. He discarded them when the records were no longer useful, choosing the latrine over burning because it was convenient. Case closed. But the carbon analysis of the wooden frames complicated that timeline significantly. The wood used in the tablet frames dated to a period at least a generation before the pit itself was sealed. That's not impossible. Tablets were reused, repaired, passed down. But it raises a question nobody has cleanly resolved. Were these tablets already old when they were discarded? Were they someone's inherited records? Someone else's entirely? And there's something else. The stylus impressions on wax surfaces don't survive as legible text. Wax flows, settles, softens over centuries. What survives is the ghost of pressure in the wax. The indentations left when someone pressed hard enough. Researchers working with raking light and early imaging techniques in the 1990s recovered fragments of text, but the method is inherently incomplete. There may be entries on those tablets that were never recovered because the stylus pressure was too light. What I found in the archives of the published analyses is a quiet acknowledgement of this problem, usually placed in a footnote. We cannot know how much we don't know. Now here's the detail that sat unaddressed. Among the fragments of Latin recovered from the tablets, one phrase appeared that didn't fit the accounting context at all. Researchers noted it, flagged it as anomalous, and then, in the published record I've traced, essentially set it aside. The phrase, rendered in abbreviated medieval Latin shorthand, appears to correspond to a legal formula. Specifically, a formula associated with debt disputes and the formal renunciation of a claim. This isn't bookkeeping language. This is courtroom language. The kind of text that appears in formal legal proceedings, not merchant ledgers. Why would a merchant's personal notebook contain the text of a legal renunciation? One possibility, it was copied there as a template, a reference the owner might need. Medieval merchants involved in credit transactions sometimes carried written formularies, collections of standard legal phrases, because access to a trained notary wasn't always immediate. But another possibility is darker, and it's the one that gets less airtime. The tablets may have recorded a specific transaction that was legally sensitive. Something that, once concluded, or once failed, needed to disappear. Not burned, because burning left ash and occasionally questions. But sealed underground, where the organic chemistry of a cesspit would dissolve the wax over time. Except it didn't. 700 years later, the impressions were still there. Few who've handled the physical tablets have written about them at length for a general audience. Most of the substantive analysis exists in German-language archaeological journals from the late 1970s through the early 2000s, and a handful of entries in broader surveys of medieval writing culture. The Erfurt tablets are not famous. They don't appear in popular books about medieval mysteries. They surface occasionally in academic footnotes as a supporting example of urban literacy, and then vanish again. That relative obscurity is itself worth sitting with. We tend to assume that unexplained things get investigated until they're explained. But the historical record is full of artifacts that simply accumulate question marks and then get filed. What we're left with is this. Sometime in the 13th century, based on the stratigraphy of the pit and the dating of associated finds, one or more literate people in Erfurt used a set of wax tablet notebooks to record accounts, copy formal Latin texts, and possibly document a legal transaction. Those tablets were old, possibly inherited or acquired second-hand. When the time came to discard them, they went into the latrine. Not smoothed and sold. Not burned. Hidden in the one place most likely to destroy written evidence. The organic chemistry failed to cooperate. The wax held. The impressions held. And when construction crews broke open that pit in 1974, they handed archaeologists a set of questions that remain, in the precise technical sense of the word, open. Who were the multiple hands? What was the legal formula doing there? Why were tablets, expensive, reusable, tradable, treated as refuse? And what else is written in the impressions that the imaging technology of the 1990s couldn't recover? Some of those questions may get answers. Multispectral imaging and photogrammetric analysis have transformed what's recoverable from ancient surfaces in the last decade. There may be a researcher somewhere, right now, with access to the tablets and better tools than anyone who's looked before. Few remember this, but the history of medieval archaeology is littered with artifacts re-examined a generation later that turned out to contain entire narratives the first investigators missed entirely. The Erfurt notebook may be one of them. And if it is, if someone does apply modern imaging to those surfaces and reads something that wasn't readable before, the question of why it was thrown into a latrine in 13th century Germany may finally get an answer that fits all the evidence. Until then, the record stays open. That's what records like this are for. If this is the kind of history that stays with you, or the quiet, unresolved kind, there's more in the archive. The next video goes further into what medieval cesspits have told us that official histories refuse to record. Watch it while it's still there.